A lot of us, especially women, are constantly carrying around an apologetic demeanor, almost like they're apologizing for their existence. It can be used against you. You're being made to feel ashamed. You're being made to feel like you're the one that's in the wrong. No, this.
Africa, Brooke, welcome to Women of Impact.
Thank you. I'm so glad that I'm here. I really am.
Really where I want to start is with something that a lot of my audience really struggle with, and that's standing up for themselves.
Yes.
So whether you're dating somebody and he's blatantly disrespecting you by looking at another girl right in front of your face, or as a family member that maybe comments on your weight or your marital status, or it's a work colleague that is completely being passive aggressive and you know that was actually a deliberate dig. All of these scenarios, many times, us women stay silent. We freeze, have no words, then we don't stand up for ourselves, we go home, and then we regret not having our own backs. So how on earth can we start to stand up for ourselves and make sure that we never regret feeling like we're being pushed around again?
Yes. You first have to understand, what are you afraid of? That's the first question that I always invite people to think about. Because for me, I remember thinking that this fear that I had of speaking up, I thought it was just isolated to my romantic relationships. I thought it was just because of my family, but I could see that it's actually everywhere. There was always this fear that I'm going to be punished. And I mean, as an adult, it didn't make any rational sense, because who's going to punish me? I'm a 30-year-old woman, I'm not in any kind of danger. But this internal thing had started when I was a child, because there had been times where I had spoken up in my family home and got into trouble for doing so. I can only change the behavior that I now exhibit as an adult if I'm curious about its origin. We want to jump to the strategy, right? But I think there's a beautiful internal process that has to take place first. Because if you're not standing up for yourself in that relationship or at work or with your family, etc., it's a pattern that has already been in motion for a long time. You first need to understand, outside of that situation, once you're home and you're like, oh, I should have said something, I'm doing this again, I haven't spoken up, why am I not speaking up? And maybe another time you will say something, but then you have this sort of vulnerability hangover where you feel like, oh my God, am I going to get into trouble for this thing?
Or guilt.
100%, either guilt or a shame or some kind of spiral of both and more. And then that's where I can feel more comfortable going to the more practical side of things, which is look for the micro moments where you can speak up for yourself. Because I think something that happens is that we're waiting for this sort of big moment where something will happen and then you stand up in a meeting and then you finally speak up for yourself.
I've seen it in the movies, Africa. You mean it's not going to happen?
We're always waiting for these sort of big, audacious moments, but I truly believe it's in the micro moments where it's most difficult, where you're served something that is cold, something that has too much salt in a restaurant, and then the waiter comes back and says, how are we doing? And your instinct is to say, we're fine, everything's okay, it's great. And it's very quick. You have to become very good at catching yourself. But I think that's where the fun can happen, when you look at these things as a sort of just an exercise, a practice, a challenge that no one else knows about apart from you. But it's in those micro moments where you self-abandon. And I think when you start to think of it as self-abandonment, depending on who you are, you might even want to look at it as self-betrayal. That's what I do. To me, I'm crossing my own boundaries in this moment. I know that this is very cold, and I know that I'm going to be paying for this. I'm being given an opportunity to say what my needs are. This is fine, but can you please warm it up a little bit? There's too much salt in this. Are we able to replace it? In those moments, I did used to feel as if I'm being too much. I'm being way too fussy. But the underlying thing was that childlike voice of, I'll get into trouble. And of course, I'm not going to get into trouble with the waiter, but it's so irrational because it's just a pattern that has been in motion for a long time. But those micro moments, you catch yourself, and you're not going to get it right every single time. You might feel like you're sort of faking it. It's that idea of faking it till you make it right. Even though I don't personally agree with that language, I prefer you're acting as the person you're becoming. I find that to be a thing that allows for me to kind of practice this courage more. We need to stop thinking that When the next big thing happens, that's when I'll say something. The next big conflict with my partner, that's when I will say something. No, it's in those tiny little things where you can feel what I call the initial ouch, where you just kind of feel something in your body, but then you make yourself think, oh, it's not that big a deal. I said something yesterday, I shouldn't say something now. And then you suppress it. But then those moments compound and then you have a big explosion because you've been imploding.
If someone's listening right now,
Yes.
where would you have them start?
There's three parts to this. If we're going to sort of look at that journey from self-censoring and not speaking up to brave expression, where you're living in courage, and it doesn't have to be a loud performance of courage, because I think we have these stereotypical ideas of what it looks like to be a brave person, a courageous person. But I think there's awareness. What are you afraid of? Then there's responsibility, which is what do you stand for? Because without even knowing what it is you stand for in terms of your values, and we'll get into it, you won't even know what it is you need to say and what your intention is behind it. And then the last part, which is expression, poses the question, what are you willing to risk? It means that I'm going to risk being misunderstood in this conversation in order to actually be who I truly am, in order not to cross my own boundaries. I'm going to risk this relationship. There's going to be a little bit of teething issues. That is a risk. But we choose not to risk anything. So then we comply, we pretend we agree with things we don't agree with. We sort of keep these tiny resentments and tell ourselves it's not that big a deal and wait for the explosion and say, now I'm going to speak up. So that's the sort of sequence of events that I think we can work with. Awareness, responsibility, and expression.
All right, let's start at number one then.
Let's do it. I think the relational aspect is usually the biggest area for a lot of people. And it gets me on a personal level too, because I wrote an entire book about brave expression. It has been my work for the past 8 years. I've worked with so many people that I even grew up watching on TV. I've worked with and I coach them and I consult them and I do all of these huge worldly things. And still, practicing brave expression in my romantic relationships, where I experience the most exposure and the most intimacy, is where I will always have my biggest work to do, because it's where a lot of the wounding is. So I find that it was really humbling actually to see that when I was single, I thought I was fine. When I was single, I was fine. I was expressing myself so bravely everywhere on stages, but then you get to see this scared little girl in romantic love. And so many women are experiencing the same thing. Women that are high-powered, if you want to call it that, but also women that just are self-aware, grounded in who they are, doing incredible things in the world. They're on their purpose, they're on their mission, but they still have that thing inside them. And I think that question of what are you truly afraid of, if we answer it without trying to answer it in an overly intellectualized way as the adult that you are, I think you can really get to the answer.
All right, so
right?
so tell me how you did it then.
When I drilled down into it, in the beginning, I thought that I was afraid of the other person thinking that I'm too much, but that was still vague. That was not it, because what does that actually sort of mean, right?
And why do you care if you're too much?
Absolutely, absolutely, yes. And then the answer was revealed as I drilled into that a little bit more. Rejection. That was the thing where it started to feel more truer, like I'm kind of getting closer to the truth. I was afraid, and I think a lot of people listening to this will resonate, I was afraid that I was going to be rejected for who I truly am, because my historical context had meant that when I had needs as a tiny little child, and I grew up in a home where there was abuse, I had a wonderful mother and a father who was also wonderful when he was sober, but he was an alcoholic, and he was an alcoholic for most of my later life. But I was in a home where it was not very safe to state what your needs were. And because my mother was in survival mode, she couldn't be emotionally available. She was very much physically available to me and my siblings. She made sure we were clothed and went to school on time and that we were fed. But in terms of emotional intimacy, there was nothing. But now as an adult, I can understand that she didn't even have anything to give to herself. So she didn't have anything left over. And she really tried. She did her absolute best. But the reality of the environment that I grew up in, which is the invitation that I'm making to people in real time for step one, just start to get curious about the environment that you grew up in your most formative years, because that will give you answers as to why you're having those feelings in that meeting. Why is it when you're in conflict? All of these things are coming up that don't make any rational sense. You're just feeling somatically overwhelmed. You can quite easily trace it back, you know, if you're willing to. So I saw that in the environment that I grew up in, when I had to say what my needs were, and I could only say my needs if I really had tried doing everything myself. If I had really, really tried doing everything myself and it didn't work and I still needed help for an adult, only then could I ask for help. Hyper independence was instilled from a ridiculously young age, but it's all I knew. So I would be punished sometimes, whether it's being shouted at or being hit by my father. And I would see the same thing happen to my siblings as well. So when we did put our needs forward, they were rejected in different ways. So that's where that seed of punishment was planted. If you say you're not happy with something, you will seem ungrateful. So in my adult mind, I had thought that maybe people would think I'm being too much. But again, that was not the absolute truth. The truth was that I will be rejected. If I really say, Lisa, I'm not happy with this. We need to have a conversation. You did something and I'm a bit upset. I would be so convinced that you are going to punish me for that. Even though logically I know that you will not. Even if you're telling me, Africa, you can tell me anything. There's something that had already happened and been etched in stone that says she's lying if she says that. So for me, the root of my self-censorship in all of my expression was the fear of being rejected and the fear of being abandoned. And even though I was no longer in that same home and I was in a completely different environment in the big wide world, there was still that coding that had been put into place. And it was so firmly in the hardware and had never been checked on.
God, we hear so much about like, don't touch the hot stove, right? Yes. Where it's like, we all can articulate and really get that, yes, if you're a kid, you touch a hot stove, amazing. You've learned a lesson. You don't go near a hot stove again. Like you literally tell yourself, in order to never blister, don't touch that. And when you think this becomes the blister of the mind almost, where it's like you have been told, don't speak up, otherwise you'll be punished. So of course your mind goes, well, you don't want the blister. You remember how much that freaking hurt. Don't do it again.
I wonder if you've had this too. Sometimes those things that are etched in stone, which again is all of the awareness, right? We're at the awareness phase of what actually is driving this thing, where even when it comes to the smallest thing, I can't speak up, or if I do, I will feel flooded with so much discomfort, even if it's something relatively small. We're getting curious about its origin so that we don't try to assign it to something that is not actually true. So we don't just try to read as many books as possible, listen to all the podcasts, and just bandage. So many bandages that actually look like they're solving something, and maybe they do for a short time, but it's still superficial. It's not actually getting to the core. I think another thing about my own wounding that I just shared, it was who said it. The who actually matters. When you start to think about, you were told that you are ungrateful if you're asking for certain things or if you're putting your needs forward, it's about who told you that. A lot of the time it's someone you really trusted. Even though my father was very abusive, he also had another side to him. He could also just be very charming and quiet and normal and just a father when he could be. So it was like a complete contradiction. But I trusted him as my caregiver, because when you're a child and you're in that, especially 0 to 7, but I think actually much older, as long as you're in the familial home and you have caregivers, you trust them. They are your first model for trust. So you believe what they say, whether it's good or bad, you believe it. And you can even find yourself for the rest of your life trying to please them, even if you know that they failed you, or even if they did all of these things to you, you will find, and you will do it through partners, you will do it through colleagues, you will do it through work, still trying to get their approval and their acceptance. So I think the who really, really matters.
And then would it be then the who supports the who? So what I mean by that is, if your mum had said something,
yes,
I think that would have reflected, oh, maybe what dad's doing
Yes.
isn't good. Maybe I should speak up. But if your
Yes.
mum wasn't
Yes.
the who that supports the who, now you've got the two people that you look up to that neither of them are saying this is wrong.
100%.
Or your mum is potentially reinforcing your dad's behavior. So that now causes you to, well, my mum didn't stand up. My dad is saying this. So it must be me. I
You
must
believe
have
it.
to. Yeah, you believe it.
You believe it. It really is that simple. You believe it.
One of the strongest memories is utterly heartbreaking, but I get married to my husband, Tom, and I take him to Cyprus to meet my grandmother for the first time. She's very Greek, like born in the mountains of Cyprus, couldn't read, taught herself to read by reading the Bible, no education, third world type life. So I'm like, this is my husband. She couldn't come to England for the wedding. She pulls me aside and she's about to give me like the words of wisdom. I'm like, well, my grandmother's been married for 60 years.
Right.
She must be able to give me like the words of wisdom that are going to help me with my marriage. And she turns around and she says, now look, if your husband hits you, don't worry, maybe you deserved it. Now, when you think about what she's been through in her life and seen and experienced, for her to truly believe that, for her to then give me that piece of advice, it is base assumptions. It's like her base assumption is that to survive, you can't rock the boat. And so if that means he hits you, cheats on you, whatever, don't rock the boat. That's her base assumption. So how many times were you given that where you couldn't speak up because your needs shouldn't be met, or now you're being fussy? And then how many times did that restrict you from being silent to saying what you wanted?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you know what it can also lead to, which I really hope as people listening to this, they go with us on this journey of uncovering. And for me, I realized that caused a split. It caused a fragmentation in terms of my identity. So in the home, I would be censoring because I had to, for safety, for actual physical safety, not just emotional and spiritual, although those were also very crucial parts of it that I discovered later on in life. I would use outside of the home to get my freedom in whatever way that I could. So there was this huge identity shift. I wasn't integrated, because if I was integrated, the person that I was in the home would be quite similar to the person that I was outside of the home. So for me, that led to, at the age of 14, discovering alcohol and going into what would become a decade-long struggle with alcohol, because I felt as though only under the influence could I truly express myself, which is something that I also hear in the present day with a lot of women, that only when they're drinking a little bit or they're under the influence can they actually be themselves. You see it all the time. Women have a particular relationship with wine where they can only feel like, okay, it's been such a long day, or I'm in a stressful relationship, or all of these things are happening at work. I can only feel truly free and comfortable and safe if I have a glass of wine, or if I have this. So there's this fragmentation that you also have to look out for. And it's part of that awareness. Look at areas of your life where, because you're repressing aspects of yourself, you have to find some kind of vice or crutch in order for you to feel fully like you.
How aware or not aware were you that was your escape mechanism?
Gosh, I wasn't aware until it became a huge problem, which is the sad part, because I think a lot of us wait until you hit absolute rock bottom before you recognize that there's a problem. But I also think we don't have to let it get there. I think something that you can do, and this is something that I find to be a very practical sort of mindset and reflective exercise. You can look at whether the things that you say, and this ties in with responsibility, what do you stand for, right? The things that you say you value, the things that you say are important to you. If you look at the results in your life right now, is that congruent? So you're saying you value health, you're saying you value relationships, you're saying you value financial freedom, you're saying you value a good work-life integration, because I don't really believe balance is a thing. Look at the results that you have in your life right now. Are you aligned with those things that you say? Or are you being shown that actually you don't value health as much as you say, because you overly plan on all of these things you're going to remove from your life, sugar, etc., etc. But then after day 2, you find yourself justifying and you're like, okay, I'll do it next week instead.
That's what I was going to say. How do you know, though, whether you're justifying or it's an excuse? Because in that moment where you're like, well, what do you expect me to do? I can either focus on my health or not take my kid to the doctor. Like there's going to be a reason, a very valid reason why you're not going to take your health. Now, what ends up happening is if you do that week after week after week, of course, you're showing yourself that your health isn't actually your most important. But people right now may push back on that thing saying, yeah, but you don't understand what X, Y, and Z fill in the blank.
That happens all the time, but I would hope that we're speaking to people right now that are willing to look at themselves, even when it's so difficult. Because I don't know that I can do much for people that are willing to make excuse after excuse after excuse, because that means there's a level of self-awareness that you need to harness. There's a level of self-scrutiny that you need to have, because no one else would know. That's the truth about it. No one else has to know if you're ditching your goals and your plans after day 2, after day 3 and starting again, but now it's been 6 months. No one has to know, but you know, you know. And it ties into that self-betrayal thing that I was saying, Lisa. When you cross your own boundaries time and time again, you start to feel it. And I think if anyone pushes back on people trying to put anything forward that could actually be beneficial for you, that's also something to look at, to be curious about. Like, why am I pushing back on this? Why do I feel so enraged by someone saying, if you keep on delaying, then you're actually in direct contradiction with what you say. So you're self-sabotaging, right? Why do I feel so enraged by it? That's something that I would get curious about. Because we know when we're lying to ourselves.
So give me an example of when you were lying to yourself. So you turn to alcohol, you have the very restrictive family, and so for you, you felt like the freedom came by going out and being wild. Talk to me about then what acts you would do and how you would justify in case someone at home's like, oh yeah, I do that.
Yeah.
Coming up.
I was losing all of my good relationships because of the person that I would become when I was drunk, because of how selfish I would become, because of how manipulative I could become. I was cheating in my relationships. I would just become a version of me that was so detached from the person I thought I was.
Thank you so much for watching the episode, guys. We're gonna get back to it in a second, but there's something that we women need to start talking about. There are chemicals in the things that we use and all around us that end up disrupting our hormones. And so once I found out, I ended up realizing that I had to change the cookware I was using because it was also one of the places where I was accidentally getting chemicals into my body and disrupting my hormones. So I changed over to Caraway, guys. These pans are 100% chemical free so that you can absolutely have faith and trust that when you come into the kitchen and you end up cooking your food, that you know it's not derailing your mission, your goals, and your confidence. And the holidays are closer than ever, so get their gift or yours in time, guys. Go and visit carawayhome.com/WOI to take advantage of this limited time offer, up to 20% off your next purchase. Again, that's carawayhome.com/WOI to get new kitchenware before the holidays. Caraway, non-toxic cookware made modern. All right, thank you so much for watching. Let's get back to the episode right now.
So for me, even though it started at a very young age, at 14, and then I got sober at 24, I still had to deal with the fallout of all of it after getting sober. The denial, and I think we're talking about denial right now in this moment in time, where there's proof and evidence in your life, but you're still saying, no, that's not the issue. It's not that big of a problem. For me, I was losing friends. My relationships were so fractured, even with my family. We lived in the same home. And when I say my family, my father passed away in 2004, still back in Zimbabwe. So my mum brought us over here and we were starting a new life. And she was really starting from absolutely nothing, raising children pretty much on the poverty line in London, studying again at the age of 38, going back to school so she could be a nurse. And we had absolutely nothing. And she was really doing her absolute best. But for us, it felt like freedom. It was absolute freedom. We didn't know that we were poor. We didn't know that we didn't have anything until you start to compare it to other people and other children. And you're like, oh, okay. Even if it's £5, it's too expensive. We just don't have it. You start to sort of pick up on things. So discovering alcohol at the age that I did, even though it ended up becoming a terrible thing, where it had its utility, but then this eventually became denial, was that I no longer had to feel like an immigrant. I no longer had to feel that I was poor. I no longer had to feel that insecurity. I could just feel like everyone else. The insecurity was completely silent. But then that became my only source of security. That became my only source of actually feeling good in my body, feeling comfortable, feeling like I could have sex confidently when the time came. So I gave it so much credit for my self-esteem, for my confidence, for any pleasure that I could actually feel in a social context. But when it all started to fall apart, I would say from the age of 19, where I started to really dive headfirst into denial, is that I was losing all of my good relationships because of the person that I would become when I was drunk, because of how selfish I would become, because of how manipulative I could become. I was cheating in my relationships. I would just become a version of me that was so detached from the person I thought I was. We have this idea of who we think we are and what we value, but is the reality matching all of those things, or are you being shown something different that you refuse to look at? So there was all of this proof that my life was falling apart. I couldn't even stay in a job for longer than a couple of weeks. If I did a month, I would feel so proud of myself because I was never able to hold anything down. But again, I would justify it with, my drinking is not that bad. Maybe I just need to stop hanging out with certain types of people. But I was with myself everywhere I went. It wasn't other people, it was always me. So I curated my social circle in a way where I would be drinking less. This was idealistic because I would still drink in the same way, binge and then black out. It was the same thing again and again. I would get paid and within a couple of days, I have absolutely no money left, but I go in survival mode, find a way to make money and then just continue. And when things would fall apart in one friendship group, I would just move to another one. Move from one job to another. No one has to know, but I knew. Just look at your life right now. You might be thinking, oh, thank God, mine is not as extreme as that, right? I think that will be a lot of people's sort of thoughts. But you have evidence in your life right now that is showing you whether you are in alignment or out of alignment, out of integrity with what you say you want from your life, with the kind of relationships you say you want, with the kind of connections. Are you in alignment with it, or does the evidence show something else? This is where you take responsibility.
So for you, what identity were you telling yourself, and how did that contradict? Because I think you were stealing, you even said you were cheating on your boyfriend, and so how did you start to realize it was completely out of alignment?
In its simplest form, I thought that I was a good person. I thought that I was a good person because in my day-to-day life, I was who I am now, a very calm person. I don't like conflict. I don't like drama. I don't like arguing. I don't like gossip. So all of these things that I thought I was, I am all of these things, and I had a shadow, right? But I thought I was just the light and that's all it is. But I would be shown when I was drunk all of these other things that I've repressed and haven't integrated. So even when I got sober, I remember thinking suddenly all of these things will go away. For sure, I wasn't stealing or I wasn't doing all of these other extreme things anymore that I did as a teenager, but holding resentments was still very much there. The tendency to manipulate in relationships was very much there. And what I mean specifically by manipulate is that because I had an inability to say what my needs were, I would just find indirect ways to get my needs met, passive aggressive ways to get my needs met, silent treatment to get my needs met. Instead of telling my partner the things that I want or the things that I don't want, the things that happened that I'm not happy about, and we have a conversation, I would punish them instead of telling them. So that is manipulation. I would use my energy. And I think women, we are so powerful when it comes to our feminine energy in terms of how we can use it for good or for bad, to manipulate a situation or to make someone feel that they've done something wrong without even telling them what it is. It happens in school. When going back after the summer holidays and your group of girlfriends are just not talking to you and no one's telling you what you've done, but you can feel it. They're manipulating the energy, and maybe when you speak to someone, they'll say, no, everything's fine, and they'll smile. But actually you can feel that something is wrong. So getting sober, I thought that would go away, but that was still very much there. So it took me reaching rock bottom, looking at myself through a very honest lens and in clarity without clouding it with alcohol, to realize that the person that I thought I was and all of these ideas that I had of myself were kind of ego stroking. Because it's nice to say that you value openness and transparency and honesty. And if you ask someone their values, they'll say things like that. The way that you are with people on a day-to-day, the quality of your relationships, and that's important, the quality of your relationships. Are people willing to be honest with you about you, or are they afraid because they know that you're defensive all the time? That was mine. I thought that thing about not really liking drama and conflict, I realized that a big part of that was because people were afraid to tell me if they were not happy about something, because I would always be defensive. So for me, it did take me hitting rock bottom to be like, oh, the person that I think I am and the idea of myself that I'm projecting to the world is not actually accurate. And I need to own that. I need to take responsibility for that. I need to make amends. I need to go to some of the people that I have disappointed greatly, and I need to take accountability for that. I need to take personal responsibility and not assign my addiction to my father, because that is a component, but it was my choice. It was my choice. So there were a lot of really difficult things that I had to reckon with in order to actually make sure that my internal world and external world were in alignment.
That's so powerful. Before we go into the responsibility
Yes.
part of it, just to wrap up the awareness part,
Yes.
I think one more thing that holds a lot of people back from being aware is feeling the shame and embarrassment around
yes.
it. And so for you to
Yes.
sit there with confidence and such beautiful transparency and say, oh yeah, I was totally the one that was manipulating my boyfriend and I knew how to push his buttons. That takes a lot of strength, I believe, to say that, because a lot of us will feel the shame and embarrassment. So I think the shame and embarrassment is actually one thing that prevents us from becoming aware of it. So how did you embrace that when you still felt badly about yourself? Because once you have the confidence, I think it's easy to be like, oh my God, I totally screwed up. But
Yes.
when you're in the moment of doing the work, you feel badly, you have low self-esteem, and now you compile it with shame and embarrassment and guilt of the way that you've behaved.
You know what I think? And I had to learn this very quickly in 2016, which is when I got sober. I realized that confidence was not just going to come. It's that idea of when I'm ready, when I feel good and safe within myself, then I will. No, that's a fantasy and a fallacy. And I realized that confidence will come from me owning my shit. I knew that I'm already consumed with shame anyway. And I knew that no one can shame me with my truth. Absolutely no one can shame me with my truth. Because if I'm holding on to these things and I'm like, oh, but this is too ugly to share, this is too, I can't say this. It can be used against you. But not even just out there, you will use it against you. You have to come to a point of being so done. You have to be so done with self-censoring. You have to be so done with hiding an addiction or a vice or a secret. Or you actually just have to make the decision, which is so easy. You can do it right now. Make the decision that you're done. And also know that no one can shame you with your truth. It doesn't mean you bear your truth, all of it immediately. It's been 8 years of me incrementally getting comfortable with sharing certain things to get to this point where I can share in this way. And there'll be more things that I'm experiencing in real time that I'm not ready to share right now, but there's no shame around it. So I think it's more of a mindset thing here, where you have to make a decision that you're not going to go deeper into shame. And you still will. But I think the shame itself is weakened by truth. That's also the reality of it. And you don't have to share anything publicly in the way that I am. It could be with one person. For me, it was with my journal for a very long time. I told everything to my journal, and I had to practice writing as if no one else was going to read it. Because something we don't bear ourselves. As much as we think we are, we don't. We write as if someone is going to read it and there'll be a Netflix documentary about
Yeah, didn't you say that in your head you were like, what if my boyfriend reads this? I'm going to write it as if he reads, which then isn't a bloody journal. It's basically a script. or a fiction novel.
Humans are amazing. I love us so much because the way we rationalize things, I think the thing around shame really is that it's a very ugly emotion to feel, and it can make us beat ourselves up even more, which makes the shame even bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. But I also like to think of shame as just the scared little child in me, the scared little child that was afraid of getting it wrong, that was told all of these things that felt really ugly and too big for a child to hold. And I don't have to hold it anymore. I just don't. So I think for me, it's important for people to know that it is a consistent practice. I was talking about micro moments right at the start. And for me, it was micro moments. Those tiny little moments where I'm just honest about what I experienced, where I feel safe enough to be truthful. And I just do that repeatedly over time. And it's just been 8 years. So I can sit here now and have a confidence and an air, but it's not, it hasn't happened just like that. And I think that's a good thing. Don't look at where people are at now. Don't compare your chapter 1 to someone's chapter 100. We do it instinctively, we just do. But we can show ourselves so much grace for it because we can use pedestalizing as an excuse to not do the thing. And I have done that at many different points, but it's just something that I refuse to do now. And I look at it as self-betrayal. You're betraying yourself by making someone else more important than you.
And that's such a powerful word as well, self-betrayal.
Yes.
Like, words matter to me
They
and they
do.
hit me so viscerally. So even
Yes.
that, being like, oh, you want to betray yourself?
Right.
Do you? Do you actually want to
Right.
betray yourself? And then
Right.
just being able to use that word in a harsh way would
Yes.
actually shake me awake.
Yes, exactly. And I think we need that. I think a lot of us need that more than we realize. But I sometimes worry that we're in a culture where we're so used to being coddled, where we're made to believe that everything needs to feel so safe and so nice. And there's a place for it, but I think it doesn't have to be so binary. You can be firm with yourself and be graceful. So I really like that ownership of, you know what, I like being firm with myself actually because it's what I need. Sometimes we need that structure and that foundation and a sense of discipline.
Yeah,
Yeah.
1,000%. And now as we go on to the responsibility, which is point number 2, to that point, I've had a health journey and I've been on I've had really bad gut issues. And I realized it all came to, oh, Lisa, this is all your fault. You chose to have a bad relationship with food. You starved yourself. You were counting calories. You were taking antibiotics. You never asked the doctors, etc., etc., etc. And the idea of it's my fault triggers a lot of people.
Yes.
And I've had a lot of backlash when I'm like, it's all your fault. Now, to your point, is the important thing to me is I use the word very deliberately. I use it because it freaking triggers me, but it triggers me into action. And I know the difference between a word that will trigger me into action or trigger me into actually retreating. And knowing thyself and knowing which words to use to actually activate you, I think it's like a superpower.
So good. The idea of taking something as it is your fault. So for me, that's not a word that I use often for myself actually. A word that I've been getting really acquainted with, which is similar to that, is ownership.
It's a very much softer word
It's
than
a much
fault.
it's a much softer word. It's a much softer word. But to me, interestingly enough, it doesn't land so softly. As someone that has a history of externalizing and assigning blame onto other people, self-responsibility is something I've really had to become friendly with. So the idea of ownership, and I write about it as ownership mentality, it's directly linked to personal responsibility. So when I'm in conflict with my partner, something that we will do, and I learned this very well from you and Tom as well, you helped me with this, is to say, when you can feel the conflict getting into a crescendo and it's hitting a peak and you're not meeting each other, you're so entrenched in the ego. Something that we'll do to really interrupt that pattern is to say, okay, this is where I take ownership. For what's happening right now, this is where I take ownership. This is my part. This is where I take blame, if you want, right? And that's really hard when you're in your ego, but especially if you've been trained to be in your ego, because you've always had that thing of, if I own up to this, then I've lost. If I own up to this, what if they reject me? What if they're saying they want me to be honest, but then they receive my flaws and then they reject me for them? So you end up doubling down in conflict. So for me, ownership has a similar flavor to fault.
It gets you to act.
Yeah, it does. It does. And it puts the onus back onto me. Yeah.
What's interesting is I use ownership in certain terms and fault in others. Again, knowing the power that it has on me, because the fault word does irk me.
It's emotive.
It's a horrible word.
Yeah.
And so I'll use it on purpose when I know what I need. But I always then have a second part of the sentence. It's all your fault, but oh my God, now it's amazing because you can change it. But because I knew with my health specifically, I was blaming the experts. I was blaming the doctors. I was blaming everybody else. And I'm like, it's the doctor's fault he gave me antibiotics. Well, hang on a minute, Lisa. Did you ever look online to see what negative effects if you've taken too many antibiotics? No, never, not once. So here I am saying it's his fault. And then I just redirect my finger. It's your fault because you took it. Right. Oh, if it's my fault that I took it, what am I going to do next time so I don't blame myself?
Right.
I'm going to do my research. And now I've got a conclusion that comes with the finger pointing.
Oh, that's good.
So it gets me to a healthy result, not a negative one. If I was to say, though, it is your fault and therefore I am bad, I am terrible, I am dumb, and now go sit in the corner and just cry because I feel so badly about myself, then the word fault doesn't serve me.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. So it's not a punishment.
No.
You don't use it as a punishment. You know what? I'm going to test it out for a little while because I love what you're saying. I found, and this is something I had to take responsibility for, I found that I had a tendency to intellectualize emotions and feelings instead of just naming them plainly. So I'm finding it interesting how I would choose the language of ownership instead of something that's like, it's your fault.
Oh, you're doing it on purpose to not get the emotion.
Yeah. So there's because you are right, there's almost like detachment from it because it's not as emotive, whereas fault has emotion to it. And it's almost the language of fault, if you're willing to look at it in the way that you do, I think it has almost an innocence and a purity to it because it's how someone actually speaks when they're upset. If someone is really upset, they don't really say, I take ownership. It's a very intellectual, it's like I'm upset, it's my fault, or I'm really upset, it's your fault. Whereas I've felt, wow, this
There's
is
judgment to it.
Yes. And if you're self-aware enough, you can use that sort of judgment in a useful way, which can then turn it to that rational thing of, okay, now I take ownership. So I quite like the allowing yourself to feel the reality of the emotion at the time and say, it's my fault. And then I'm going to take ownership for it in this way. So even in my relationship, I have been learning, especially over the past 3 to 4 years, to just say I'm sad or I'm upset. Like, it's so simple, but it's true and it's connective. Whereas if I go into a more intellectualized way of saying what I feel and the sort of emotions behind it, etc., it's detached. But I realize it's because in the home that I grew up in the way that I grew up, you couldn't say I'm sad or you're upset. You deal with it yourself and then it's dealt with. So you don't really speak about your emotions. You're in solution mode. You fix it. So there's a vulnerability into saying, you know what, I'm really sad, or I'm upset, or I feel hurt, or I feel like it's my fault, or I feel like it's yours.
Yeah, I mean, you're really being vulnerable when you're saying that, especially if you're with somebody who's manipulative. If you're like, I feel like it's my fault, they're like, of course it is. And now they're actually using that trigger to make it even worse, not to help you out of it. So it also dependent on who you're with. It
really is.
So even with that and taking that with the ownership part then, talk to me about the word sorry. Because if you're in a relationship where someone's always looking to you to apologize, a lot of the time I think we'll say sorry just to make the peace. So you call it like the honest conflict versus the dishonest harmony. I think many people Many people have the dishonest harmony relationship where they say sorry because, oh my God, especially guys, I've heard this, where guys are like, she just won't stop talking about her emotions and how upset I made her until I say sorry. So I just say sorry just to stop the fight.
Yes.
Let's say the woman and you're in a manipulative relationship, sometimes you just say sorry to keep the peace because you know where this is about to go. So talk to me about how to take ownership and apologize when it really is true, and how that actually helps you from eventually standing up for yourself, and the opposite of how to, when you say sorry and you don't mean it, and why that can be so detrimental.
Do you find yourself just carrying around an apologetic demeanor everywhere you are? This is a huge thing. Whether you're at work or you're in a meeting or you're just walking down the street or you're in a shop or you're waiting for a taxi or you're with friends, you're sitting around a table. A lot of us, especially women, are constantly carrying around like an apologetic demeanor, almost like they're apologizing for their existence. It's a massive, massive thing. And when it comes to brave expression, and then I'll go directly to what you just brought up, Lisa, but when it comes to brave expression and everything that we're speaking about, I don't want us to believe that it's limited to what you say. It's who you're being in the world, even when you're silent. Because there are some people that can walk into a room and because of their confidence and self-esteem, you can feel them. You can feel their energy in a room. And you're like, who's that person? Their confidence kind of just radiates and their aura. And there are also some people who are the complete opposite or somewhere in the middle, depending where they are, where there's just an air of insecurity. And we're here to have straight, direct conversations, right? And we've been doing this. If you constantly have an air of insecurity around you and this apologetic demeanor, you make yourself very attractive to people that are going to make sure they sort of take advantage of that. And this doesn't mean that it justifies anything like abuse or any extremes. This is not what we're talking about. I'm actually talking in very daily conversations. Even if something is happening at work and there's a big project and they want someone to lead, if you're carrying around an apologetic demeanor all the time and an air of insecurity, but you're saying the right things, you're likely not going to get that project because there's an incongruence. You're saying the right things, but everything else is just not matching. So there's a mistrust that you're exhibiting already. So when it comes to this habitual saying of sorry, again, instead of us just going into that moment in time where it happens, I want you to go back and check in on how you're being in the world in general. Do you find yourself just having that apologetic demeanor where you're almost just saying sorry? If someone was to step on your foot, you would say, sorry.
I'm so sorry you stepped on my foot. I'm sorry my foot was under yours.
Right? Before I carry on with this, have you had experience with any of that yourself or with women that you speak to? Just the sort of apologetic air that some women carry?
Oh, 1,000%. I used to have it all the time. And now, because I'm so self-aware, because I've done so much work, when a woman does that around me, I call her on it.
Yeah.
Like, I try to empower her in the sense of like, hey, look, you're freaking amazing. You didn't do anything wrong. Why were you apologizing? And they're like, well, as an example, one of my friends actually was telling me a story about how she was getting her hair washed. And so she was at a hair salon. And sometimes they would leave the shampoo in for like 5 minutes because it was like, it will condition your hair. And this woman, she's a psychologist, and she was sitting there getting anxious because she was taking up the sink. And so she was apologizing to the hairdresser for taking up the sink, even though it was a service she was paying because she saw all these women waiting. And so in that moment, like if I was there, I'd be like, you don't apologize.
Yes.
You take up the space. And so I think when someone then gives you permission, which obviously it can be used for good or bad, right? But if someone empowering gives you permission there in that moment to be like, hey, homie, you've got this. Like, own it. Like, own the space.
Yes.
It allows you to. But I think we have been conditioned so much, going back to the guy patting me on the head, where it's like women shouldn't take up space.
Yeah. Should be seen and not heard. It's that idea. Because sorry means something. Sorry is really, really important because it's saying, I take responsibility, I acknowledge what I did, and I truly believe that there's something here that I need to apologize for. That is at the essence of it. But if you're finding yourself instinctively saying sorry just so you can keep the peace but cause internal chaos in yourself, there's an illusion of keeping the peace because there's something happening internally when you apologize for things that you know you don't need to apologize for. But then I think it can be a very damaging thing over time because it really weakens your discernment muscle. I want to know when I'm apologizing that I'm actually apologizing for something that I need to. Whereas if everything warrants an apology, I erode my self-trust because now I just apologize just to apologize. If someone steps on me or if I'm just feeling like I'm taking up too much time, there was a thing that I also had myself some time ago of I get massages all the time. Sometimes they'll be like a couple of hours or 2.5 hours. I found that I would have this thing of being like, oh my God, am I taking too much time? She's working, she's been 2 hours. And I'm like, you're getting a massage. You're supposed to be here relaxing. You're paying money to receive. There's also something in there about receiving. We need to sort of practice just receiving and taking space in the world. It really is that idea of taking up space, even in your relationship. Taking up enough space to say, I understand where you're coming from, but I don't believe that I have done anything wrong for these reasons, right? It requires you to be willing to hear what someone else is saying and say, I understand, and this is my perspective, not you're absolutely right, I'm so sorry. Because that is a practice. It's not just happening in that moment in time. You've been practicing it everywhere else.
Oh God, and I think, I don't know if you found this, I'm super curious. When I met my husband, I had kind of been brought up, there was always the guys that apologize. It's always the guys that say sorry.
Yes.
So I would just look, whenever me and my husband would have an argument, I would look to him to just like, oh, wait, where's my apology? Yes. You've hurt my feelings. And then it became the point where we actually had to have a discussion about when to apologize. And so we came up with an agreement. We call it in our emotionally sober moments. So when we're not arguing, when we're not in that moment of like turmoil. So when we're really aligned, when we're feeling great, we have the discussion and we spoke about the word sorry. And so we said, okay, we agree that neither of us should ever apologize when they don't mean it. Do you agree? Do I agree? Yes. Okay, so if we're in a discussion and I don't say I'm sorry, know that I'm doing it because I truly don't believe that I'm sorry. So we gave each other permission. And now what we do in the middle of sometimes arguments, I'll say, or he'll say, I really want to say I'm sorry right now to end the fight, but I can't apologize to you. Or sometimes we'll say, I'm sorry your feelings are hurt, but I'm not going to take back what I said because what I said was true. Yes. And now if I backtrack, going back to your quote about being honest but uncomfortable, that is better than being in a dishonest relationship with harmony.
I love how tangible that is because that's exactly what my partner and I do. Because I have really come to realize that in the moment, sorry can really give you the idea that it's been resolved. Because again, it satiates the ego, especially if you believe that you were right and the other person was wrong, which is usually the case in conflict. The default is to want the other person to admit that they are wrong and to tell you that you are right. And sorry usually covers all of that ground, right? So in the moment, it can feel like, okay, we've sort of resolved this. But then the reason why a lot of couples, and even in friendships, this happens, even in family dynamics, there'll always be a reoccurring issue around whatever the thing is because it's being superficially resolved. It's not actually being resolved. Sorry is the Band-Aid that keeps it on, keeps the wound together for like a day or two, even a week or a month, and then the same conflict comes up again. So when you're reaching to sorry as the default, you will find yourself in perpetual conflict. That's something that I realized, but I had to start thinking of different ways to give the person what they need, which is what you've just put forward as an example of the thing of saying, I'm genuinely sorry that you feel hurt in this way, because it's still giving something, it's still acknowledging. Because I do think that it can be quite cold to say, you know what, I don't think that I'm sorry. I'm not sorry for this. Because I want us to be effective in how we communicate, because you're still being in integrity when you say, I'm really sorry that you feel hurt about this. But from my perspective, X, Y, Z. And some people are just naturally more blunt, they're more direct, but I think we can all work with our communication styles. I think you can understand who you're communicating with, and I talk about this extensively, that some of us are just much more firm, some of us are a little bit more passive and tender, so we need a certain way to communicate. And I truly believe that if you care about the person you're in relationship with, which I would hope that you do as a default, you want to see the way in which they work, and you want to be able to modify your speech. Again, you're not self-censoring, but you are using what I call a social filter to gauge who the person is, how they communicate, what works in this dynamic, because you don't have to be the exact same person every single word to be in integrity. You need behavioral flexibility. And I think that example of, I'm really sorry that this has upset you. I don't want you to be upset right now, but this is where I am coming from. I hope you can understand that. We don't have to be so black and white, I'm sorry or I'm not sorry. Like there's a beautiful middle there that you can explore when you know the person that you're speaking with.
Yeah. So true. So you actually said the self-censoring versus
social filtering.
Yes. How the hell do we know and are able to identify in the moment which one we're doing?
Yes.
Because it can get very confusing when you're around somebody that you really care about, let's say you really respect them, and you see on their face that they've had a visceral distaste to something you've done or said.
Yes.
In that moment, so much your mind kind of, like racing at 1,000 miles an hour, like drrr, like a computer, right? Like, oh shit, what do I say now? How do you know in that moment which one is self-censoring versus I keep forgetting the word.
Social filtering.
Social filtering.
Self-censoring is when you're withholding, okay? You're withholding your ideas and your speech and your thoughts and your mind and your general expression, be it internal, external, but you're doing it because you're afraid. And this is very subconscious. It's not a very conscious thing. A lot of us can be aware of it in some situations where it's just obvious that I'm not saying this thing right now because I'm really scared of how the person will respond. That's when it's obvious sometimes, but a lot of the time it's just this, again, unconscious tape that has just been running for a very long time. You just don't speak your mind. You agree with things that you don't actually agree with. And you're around a dinner table, so everyone says the same opinion. You're like, yeah, me too. You're training yourself to be that way. But ultimately, you're afraid that if you truly express yourself, something negative is going to happen. So you associate full, honest expression with some kind of punishment. So it's driven by fear, self-censoring, you're withholding. Whereas social filtering is actually a thinking skill that we use all the time. And we use it very unconsciously as we move through the world. You just know what to say, what not to say. And I appreciate that there might be some people that are neurodivergent, so their brains work in a very different way. But I would like to think you have an idea of sort of how you operate if you know that you're neurodivergent. But if you are neurotypical, we use it all the time. It's about taking your audience into account. So who am I speaking to? Will they get this joke, or is this group of friends actually maybe the better one? We call it code switching sometimes, where at work you might speak in a certain way that you don't actually speak like in your social circle because you understand the need for behavioral flexibility, right? So it's driven by discernment. So self-censorship is fear. Social filtering, which we all do, is driven by discerning time, place, location, audience, even the timing of things. Do I bring up this conversation now? Or do I bring it up later because Lisa looks a little bit busy? She's had a long day, now is not the time. That's social filtering, it's not self-censorship. Whereas if I say, oh, I can't say this to Lisa because she's gonna be so upset, and I go into a spiral of narrative and assumptions to the point of not saying anything, then that's self-censorship. So those are the two distinctions between the two.
Thank you for breaking that down.
Yeah.
And it actually reminds me, I interviewed a cult profiler. Ooh. And he basically studies cults and helps people escape cults and deprograms them from the brainwashing. And such a big part of it is the group think, right? It's that if you're in this cult and you start to notice, because no one ever says they're a cult, right? So it's like, you're like, is that normal? And you turn
Yes.
around to people around you and everyone's like, of course it's not. Are you questioning?
Yes.
And that groupthink and that pressure now then conforms you to saying and doing something that doesn't align. So the easier one that I think about is potentially the covert narcissist, where no one actually realizes they're a narcissist, and your family, let's say you're dating and your family love them. No one actually sees the truth. So everyone's telling you they're amazing, they're amazing, they're amazing. And before you realize it, you're just listening to them because you want to conform.
Yes.
Now, I don't know if you heard of the string study. Have you heard this? All right, well, I've actually got a little diagram to show you. I was like, I hope you haven't seen it. All right. So they do this study. I'm going to read it out now.
Please.
So it's called the straw study. They get a group of 8 males in a college and they get them all to participate in a simple perceptual task.
Yeah.
And there's 8 men, 7 of them are actually actors. And 1 of them is a real person. So they say, okay, look at the string on the left. And now on the right, which one is that string, lengthwise? And so I'm asking you, what's your answer?
C.
Okay, so now the study goes, in the controlled group with no pressure to conform towards the actors, the error rate for the person that wasn't an actor was 0.7%. As soon as the actors started to put pressure and act like they were so certain that it was, let's say, A, they change their response. And they get it wrong by 35.7%.
Oh my gosh.
So talk to me about how people conform, why something as simple as you can see without a doubt, it's definitely not A and it's definitely not B. But yet, because of the pressure with people that you're surrounded by, you feel so compelled to say the answer that they say.
Gosh.
So talk to me about what is happening. Talk to me about that pressure of conforming and how we start to identify that we're conforming. So I know that obviously you said awareness, and now how do we take responsibility for us conforming to it?
Yes.
And then what can we do to change? Coming up.
Once you're back with your family, you feel like you owe them a very specific version of you. And you have to completely shatter that to the ground. And it might be a very difficult thing to do. It doesn't mean you blow the lid on everything, but I'm so sorry, for some of us, it does mean that.
Thanks so much, guys, for watching me in Africa. We'll get right back to the episode in a second, but I just want to talk about something that's really important. Now, if you're like me and you freaking love the holidays, but you're honestly struggling with having enough energy just to get through the workday, let alone go shopping, decorating, the holiday parties, the gift wrapping, and the cooking, then listen up, my homies, because you don't need another cup of coffee, which will actually just upset your stomach or give you the jitters or make you totally crash. Instead, you should really try this coffee replacement from Peak that is actually designed for us women. It's called Nandaka. And that's because Nandaka is expertly formulated with only the highest quality and purest ingredients. Every cup of Nandaka actually nourishes you and uplifts your energy instead of making you feel super anxious and jittery like coffee can. And right now you can actually take advantage of Peak's never before seen blowout Black Friday special. Now guys, from now until November 24th, you can get 20% off site-wide, but only while supplies last. So click the link in the show notes and try Nandaka from Peak this holiday season. Happy holidays, guys. Now back to the episode.
Yes, and you know what, that example that you've just given, I actually had goosebumps as you were talking me through it, because I feel like it's reflective of so much that is happening in the world right now. But something that I find important to talk about is that this is so ancient. I think sometimes we look at everything that's happening in the world with the polarization and the level of division and the echo chambers and groupthink, especially online on social media. And we tend to think that it's a new problem, right? But this is so primal. And I think this is where we can give ourselves some grace before we get to the more strategic side of this conversation. But it is such a primal thing, because there was a time when you needed to be in uniform with the tribe in terms of your thinking, in terms of your physicality. Otherwise, you're going to die. You know, you couldn't deviate from it. You couldn't be the maverick. You couldn't be the one that thinks differently and wants to. You had to be in uniform to survive. So we absolutely still have that survival mechanism within us. It just manifests in different ways today. But what I'm trying to ask people to do, whether it's with my work or even with this conversation, some of the things that I put forward, is to really do things that are very unnatural, because we're wired for belonging. We will go to great lengths to belong. And I always like to refer back to school, because most of us will be able to think of examples where we've done certain things to belong, whether it's how we did our hair or how we started speaking or the music we started listening to, or didn't tell people we listened to this because, you know, we won't be accepted by the group. There's so many examples from our own historical context that show you the lengths that you're willing to go to belong. So when we then experience things in real time where we find ourselves agreeing around that dinner table, or even with a partner sharing certain things, but you think, oh, if I tell them that actually my values are more like this, they might not want to be with me anymore. They might not understand. So let me just agree. Again, it's so subconscious. We don't say to ourselves, I'm going to comply now.
Right.
We just want to belong. So we'll step outside of what is truly being integrity, and we think we're just doing it this one time, and we do it again, and we do it again, and again, and again, until it just becomes what you do, you know. So it's actually a very unnatural thing to say, what are my values? Do I value freedom? Do I truly value transparency? Do I value openness? Do I value curiosity? Do I value diverse thinking? Being so clear about those things, and then really doing your best from moment to moment to be in alignment with that. It's a very unnatural thing to do, because out there in the world, online or offline, you will have groups of people saying this is the right way to think. This is how you should be in the world. This is how you should be as a woman, depending what culture you're from. That's a massive thing. Women are like this, men are like this. This is how you should be. This is the kind of home you should have. This is the kind of job you should have. You should buy a house instead of renting. You're wasting money if you do this. There's so many examples of groupthink, and they're not going anywhere anytime soon. That's just the reality of it. But I think it doesn't have to be a depressing thing. They've always been there. It's not like they're suddenly there and there. It's just different manifestations of it and different morphings. But I think this is why it is so crucial to know what your own values are, and to know what you stand for and what you're willing to risk in order to be in alignment. Because I would say groupthink is actually the easy route, because you get to just fit in and you get to, you know, not cause any sort of trouble, but you're causing so much internal trouble for yourself, because you know that you're not actually being fully expressed. And maybe you can only be you behind closed doors. And then out there in the world, people think you're this kind of person. And you see this all the time, politically, especially, where behind closed doors, people agree with certain things, but out there in the world to the public, you would never know. They're performing, they have the mask. So I think it's just needing to make a very clear decision about whether you want to continue wearing the mask, because the mask gives you the illusion of safety because many other people are wearing their own. But I think something so wonderful can happen when you put it down, because you find your people. I think we're made to believe that you don't, but that couldn't be further from the truth. You find your people that are like, thank goodness. You really, really do. But I think there's a lot of discomfort that you have to wade through to even get there.
In your book, though, you talk about how people say that they want honesty, but sometimes actually they don't want to hear the truth.
Yes.
And so as you start to write out your values, though, how do you start to make sure that they actually are true and they're not just BS that you've written down that feel good, but actually you're not in alignment, and you keep the blinders on so you don't see that, homie, you were the one that said you want honesty, and I'm being honest, and now you're like having a fit about it.
Man, it's... On a personal level, Lisa, this was one of the most confronting aspects for me, actually, because it's where I was shown that my romantic relationship with my partner, that this was the best training ground for me to really see whether I'm in alignment with my values. Because a lot of the values that people would mention, which I'll sort of say out loud in a moment, you see all of them in relationships, in intimate relationships. So you say you want honesty, you say you want transparency, you say you want curiosity, you say you want diverse thinking, you say you want freedom. All of it all presents itself in romantic love. That's where you're really shown, ooh, really? Are you sure? You say you want that, but are you sure? If your partner was to be completely transparent with you about how they experience you, which was a conversation my partner.
Did you have this conversation?
Him and I had a
what did he say?
big conversation after a conflict. Absolutely. We had a big conversation after a massive conflict. And he was saying to me, Africa, I need to be very honest with you about how you can be in conflict. And of course, I was like, yes.
You're like, come on, I can handle this, thinking it's going to be amazing.
Tell me I'm amazing and I'm open-minded and I practice what I preach. Thank you.
And I'm very articulate and I can tell you exactly how I'm feeling without emotionally derailing.
I was humbled in the most wonderful way. He was like to me, and he's such a wonderful man. He's very emotionally intelligent. He's very grounded in how he puts things forward. Even if it's very difficult, he'll be very honest. He's not going to sugarcoat things, but it's wrapped up in so much love, not coddling, love. And he was saying, sometimes you can make it very difficult for me to be really honest with you because of how defensive you can be. And so ironically, my defenses went up.
I knew you were going to say that. You're like, what do you mean? I'm not being defensive. I'm not a defensive person.
Lisa, my defenses went up in a way that I have never experienced before, but I saw them, I caught them. Because I've become very good at sort of catching, right, because of this work. But I still felt, and because it's someone I love, because it's someone I respect, because he's all of these things that I truly admire, it brought up the shame because it felt like suddenly he was not seeing me as perfect. Because that's what happens a lot of the time with women when we have to take accountability, right? We're afraid of not being seen as together, as perfect, as being, again, aligned, right? Whereas I think for men and boys, they're raised to take accountability. They really are. Even amongst boys, amongst men, they do it with each other. If they think he's fucked up, they'll tell each other very directly. But as women, I worry sometimes that we don't call each other out enough. We don't inspire and encourage each other to take accountability enough. And I think sometimes we will even co-sign, and I say this lovingly to all of us. Me and my girlfriends were speaking about this just yesterday, actually. Sometimes we will co-sign bad behavior without even realizing, because we're not being introspective enough to check our own bad behavior. So when I had him sitting in front of me, telling me this so-called expert in brave expression and courage and you know, all of the work that I do, which is absolutely true and in alignment, but there's a version of me that I will only ever see in this deep container of intimacy. Telling me that sometimes, but of course, in that defensive mind, you hear sometimes as all the time, right? Sometimes, Africa, you can make it very difficult for me to actually tell you how I'm experiencing you and some of my needs in conversation and in conflict, because you can become very defensive. And when you become defensive, you shut down immediately. So my default used to be shutting down, because again, in the environment that I grew up in, you shut down. You don't say anything back, because if you do, there'll be negative consequences for it, right? But again, that was the thing that I then carried with me, of shutting down. And even if I'm still physically in the conflict, he was telling me that I would then become cold, which makes the other person not feel like they can even tell you anything else, because you're becoming cold. Whereas if someone is telling you something, and this is what I practice now, even if I feel hurt by it and I can feel my heart closing, I will still have my hand on his knee to show him that I'm still present, that it's uncomfortable, but I'm still there. Whereas if my body language then becomes detached, it's like I'm in enemy mode, right? You're my enemy. Now we're in battle. But this is where maybe we can kind of really make it very clear. There's a difference between having desired values. So I want to be the kind of person that values honesty. I want to be the kind of person that values transparency and curiosity and open-mindedness, but I just haven't quite embodied it yet. And I will embody it through practice. I think it's so good to be honest. We just have to be so honest, because if you truly believe and hold on to this idea that you're embodied in every single value you hold, you won't see your blind spots. They will remain blind spots. And you will have this air around you of self-righteousness without even realizing. Like you have this air of, I know it all, I have it all together, I'm fine, that people won't even feel comfortable checking you sometimes. And you will think it's because you're perfect, that no one checks you. But it's because you're creating unconsciously an environment where people don't feel like they can say anything without you being defensive or pushing back. So that was my big, ooh, thank you. That was my huge thank you.
Wow, that's so hard to hear and do. And one of the things that Tom and I do is give each other permission to call me out, to call me out on the promises I said that I want to make. And so if I'm unaware that I'm not living in alignment as my partner, I am asking him to hold me accountable to that, because I may not see it. Now, you have to, number one, really truly believe that your partner wants what's best for you. Because obviously if you don't really believe that, then you're like, can I trust them that they're telling me to do this or X, Y, and Z? So I think that's super important. And then two, when I gave Tom the permission to be honest with me and vice versa, it means, okay, but that means I'm gonna say some hard things that you're not gonna like. And so going to still the number two, where it's like you take responsibility, I take responsibility for my responses. And so in that moment where I say, hey, look, this is the commitment I want to make to myself. If you see me acting out of alignment, call me on it. And my responsibility is that I will receive that because you are doing what I need in order to change.
Yes. Yes.
And it's freaking hard, girl. There was one time that, there were two moments. So number one, me getting in front of the camera, I was petrified of the camera. I was bullied and teased for my looks. I'm mildly dyslexic. Like there's a lot of things that I can say are wrong with me.
Sure.
And so I told my husband that I wanted to help women. And so I was like, I really want to help women. So I might do this thing called a podcast, but I'm just gonna call my friends and I'm just gonna do it over Zoom. And so he pulls me aside and he's like, babe, we've got a studio downstairs in our house. We've got 6 cameras. Right now, you tell me you want to help women, but you're not getting in front of the camera. So you're telling me one thing, but not acting in alignment. And because he pointed that out to me, what I realized was I had to make a decision between my ego and my mission. And when I could be that honest with myself, I was able to be like, well, screw that. I'm not going to let my ego get in the way of my mission. And so that's how the show started. That's how Women of Impact came about. Now, once upon a time, the insecure Lisa, he would have said that. And I'd be like, that's so, how can you say that? That's so mean to tell me that I should go in front of the camera, right? I would have put it on him that he's putting the responsibility or the pressure on me. But really, he wasn't. So I think giving each other those permissions. And then the final thing is, this is a little controversial, but because of you, I'm going to say it in a way. Insecurity isn't sexy.
Yes. Yes, yes, yes.
And me and my husband had to be very honest about, I will always create space for you. If you're insecure in moments, I will always honor that. I will always respect that, and vice versa. But if you tell me that you're insecure about something, but I see every single day that you're not willing to do what it takes to not become, secure, I am going to call you on that. Because your insecurity, I know that you want to build confidence. I know that you want to be sexy towards me. I know that you want to improve. But if I'm unable to tell you that right now you're not doing the work, I have to be able to be that honest with you because I care about what you want and I care about your goals. So that ended up happening. My husband was saying that he really wanted to work out and he wanted to lift weights, and every day he wasn't eating in accordance and he wasn't going to the gym, and all he would do every single day is complain about the size of his arms. And in one moment, out of true honesty and respect and caring about my husband and what he said he wanted, I'm just like, you're not acting in accordance. All you're doing is saying what you're insecure about, and you're not making a change. And so now you want to build your confidence, but actually it's less sexy. It's less confident that you're showing up.
That's one of the most incredible things anyone has ever shared with me in conversation, especially because it's something that me and my partner did. It's something that we did, and it changed so much about our relationship, because both of us are very serious about not being victims, whether it's being victims to our past or being victims to some imagined future or present. So when we talk about the things that we want and want to create, we have to hold each other accountable to it, because allowing for the insecurity to put you into a position of victimhood happens so easily. It really happens. Even to those of us that believe that we're not victims and we're against victimhood, etc., it can happen in very subtle and unconscious ways. And that thing of insecurity is not sexy. It's something that I think everyone can resonate with. I think it's language that some people might not be comfortable with, but it doesn't mean they don't agree with it. I just think people don't hear things in that kind of direct way, like just very direct language, talking to the human experience. Because for me, I want to be seen by my man as someone that is in integrity. That's a very sexy thing. I want to see him as someone that is in integrity. Even when he's weak and he falls, we can talk about it, come together, but we move forward. Once you have that awareness that we're speaking about in terms of what you're actually afraid of, your historical context, just getting curious. If you have trouble speaking up, or the other side of this, which we actually haven't spoken about, is I speak a lot about people that self-censorship is actually not their issue. Having a refined social filter is their issue, where they say everything, where they are still ineffective with their communication because they think they need to say everything that comes to mind. But actually the results that they're seeing in their life is showing that this something here is not working. Something here is really not working in my relationships or with my family or even with my audience and my clients. There's just something that is not quite working. And I think this conversation is useful for even those people too, because you need discernment. You need to have an understanding of yourself. You need to know whether the way you're currently operating is working for you or against you. You have to have that understanding. Even that idea of, I say everything and I want to be the loudest person in the room because there's an insecurity that's driving it, that people will think I'm weak, or people will think I don't know enough, or people will think I'm not courageous enough, so I need to take up all of the space. That's something else that ends up happening when you're just ineffective in your communication and you don't have the awareness, the social filtering, But to get to expression, which is kind of what you're saying in terms of you've made all of these decisions about how you're going to be in relationship. You and Tom have made these agreements. You've had conflicts and you've brought to awareness that, okay, these are the things that we're afraid of. These are the things that we actually value. But now you have to put it into practice. Now you're brought to a situation where something actually happens where you're like, oh, that thing I said I was going to do, that thing that I said I was going to bring up, if something ever happens and we call each other out, I'm now actually being presented with an opportunity to do it. I'm actually being presented with an opportunity to express. I have the awareness. I said I'd take responsibility. Now I have to express. Like you said, it is easier said than done, It is so much easier when the thing hasn't happened yet and you haven't been brought a situation where now you have to step into the playground and really show your stuff. And this is where a lot of people will just revert back and say, you know what, I'll leave it this time. No, he doesn't need to be told this time around. If it happens next time, then I'll say it, right?
Because in that moment, you punt it down the line.
You do. And I want us to be really aware of those moments where suddenly you're hit with the discomfort of actually having to follow through. It's all about follow through. Are you actually going to follow through with that understanding of values, that exercise that you did, and that understanding of your background, and that you've been doing this for longer than you like? The next opportunity that is presented to you for you to put that into action, are you going to take it, or are you just going to fob it off to next week or something? Or are you going to wait until there's a bigger argument and a bigger conflict and a bigger irritation for you to say something. So it sort of brings us back to the micro moments thing where there's so many moments for you to be in expression. And I think we miss out on them if we just buy into the physical discomfort that we feel, because that's usually what happens. You somatically feel the thing, then you're like, yeah, no, I'm not doing this right now. I'll do it next time. And there's a time and a place for being discerning and being like, okay, is this a conversation for now? Or should I leave it until after he finishes recording? Because if I bring this up now, it might actually ruin the thing that he's about to do next. There's that kind of discernment, but there's just completely saying, yeah, I'm not dealing with this right now. We'll do it another time. And then you find yourself back to the beginning again, where you're being faced with the same problem. Yeah.
So how do you then know how to express yourself? So if you've done all this work and you've done the 2 steps, now you're on the 3rd one, and you're like, okay, I've done the work, I'm taking accountability, I've reflected, and now you're put in the first moment where your boyfriend comes to you and he's just like, you're really defensive, but your identity is being the person that's always open. So now you're kind of somewhat triggered. Your identity is being questioned. How did you make sure then to keep in the expression of talking through it, standing up for yourself, saying the truth, saying the hard thing, without A, going backwards like you said, and then B, I've never been addicted to alcohol, so I don't know, so pardon my ignorance here, but I would think that sometimes when things are hard, that becomes an option. And I don't know if that's true, but if it is, when you're about to say something hard, when you're about to do the hard thing, many people may revert back to whether it's alcohol or whether it's just a negative belief system. How do you make sure you don't? And then how do you make sure that you are open in your expression without being aggressive?
Accept that you're not going to get it perfect. Because for a lot of us listening, I have a feeling, just spidey senses tells me that some of us might also struggle with perfectionism, right? Which is why when our identity is challenged, it can feel very abrasive to the spirit because you feel like, oh, I'm no longer perfect in this person's eyes. So I think something that I personally had to really accept is that I was not going to get it perfect, but I was not going to use that as an excuse to not try. That's also important. So it's like that, it's just that beautiful balance you always have to be in. It's not a thing of, well, I'm not going to get it perfect anyway, so I'm trying my best.
Right. I'm not going to get it perfect, so I may as well not try in the first place.
Absolutely. So that's not what we're doing here. That's a cop-out. That's not what we're trying to do. It's just having the awareness of, I am going to do my best. Even if my best is not the best that it's going to be in 3 months or 6 months, I'm going to do my best in this moment. Even if my ego feels so challenged, I will do my absolute best. So something that was really useful for me with that specific example was to, first of all, be honest with him about how I felt, about how difficult it was to hear. I had to even use language like, I can feel my heart closing right now. So this is very contextual to different relationships, but I'm going to go with the example of it being with an intimate partner, because this is where you might have to face so much more of this than anywhere else. I think there's a trickle in whatever your deepest and most intimate relationship is. I think that's the best training ground because that tends to have a trickle into other places as well. So for me, as someone that I'm being told that I get defensive, and immediately my defensive come up and I see them, and a part of me, a very big part of me, wants to double down and use my intellect and analytical mind to, again, manipulate the situation and tell the person why it's not actually me being defensive. Maybe you might dress it up as you being passionate. It's just you knowing what it is you want. There's so many ways that we can sort of, again, just completely dismiss what the other person has just said, but you just dress it up a little bit differently. And I always say, especially for the people that lead with intellect, people that are more cerebral, your tendency to self-sabotage is as smart as you are. That's just the smarter you get, that self-sabotage gets smart as well. And it will just find very smart ways to, again, not take accountability, because ultimately that's what it is. So for me, in truly expressing myself from an honest place, I was now grounded in my values because I was already writing. It was around the time that I was writing the chapter and segment on values, actually. So I've taken myself through them. So I had to ground myself and practice the embodiment of honesty, of transparency, of open-mindedness and being curious. So in this moment, before I even express myself outwardly, there's almost like a sequence of expression that has to happen inside you. And this is really important. I don't want us to just go into the world saying things. Your internal world has to be aligned with whatever's going to come out. So I've decided that I'm truly a curious person, not superficially, like I'm truly curious. So I'm curious about where he's coming from. So even if right now I don't understand, or at least a part of me doesn't want to understand where I'm defensive, I'm curious about his perspective. I'm genuinely curious about it. And I trust this person. So I'm open to what they have to say. Not because I'm sort of constructing this smart rebuttal and this thing. No, I'm actually just being truly open-minded and truly listening, and I'm being truly curious. So I was filtering what he was saying, and through practice, you can do this with every conversation. And it doesn't mean you discard your boundaries depending on the context. It just means you're actually leading with your values, taking in what's being said, allowing for it to sit for a moment without just doing the ping pong. You know, you're allowing for it to actually sit, and then expressing yourself from a grounded place. Say, you know what, I can be defensive. Thank you for telling me that. You know, it's really, really hard to hear, but you're the first person that has actually told me that, and I'm really grateful, you know. So I had to actually recognize that I feel defensive because I feel challenged, but also because a part of me feels a bit of shame because my person no longer sees me as perfect, you know. Like there's a facade that has cracked, and I have to be okay with that. But it only means that we're going to get even deeper in intimacy. In that specific context, I again took ownership, and I thanked him for feeling safe enough and being honest enough to actually tell me. So that's, again, depending on what's happening in your world, that's the thing that I had to face in that moment. That was my expression.
That was so powerful. And the thing that you missed that you've done that you actually speak about in your book is the power of pause.
Yes.
The fact that you paused and you allowed it to come in, for me, gives me an opportunity to ask myself this question. Is this really true?
Yes.
Because that was going to be my follow-up question with you. Because in those moments where you trust somebody, you love them, you're vulnerable around them, they're vulnerable around you, they tell you their opinion, they're not faking it, they're not lying, they're telling you what they actually think, but it doesn't mean it is truth.
Absolutely.
So in that pause moment, it is important to assess your own feeling, but actually go, it doesn't make, what he says doesn't mean that it's actually fact.
100%.
Because I think sometimes when you go do the work and you go into the ownership part, you go, oh, well, I love them, I respect them, therefore it must be true, therefore I must take ownership and I must make a change.
Yes.
But sometimes, like what I'll say to my husband is, it doesn't feel true right now. And I'll say right now because I want that time to process it, but it allows me to not shut down, but it allows me to also go, oh my God, you're right, okay, I'm so sorry. And then going back to what we said about the sorry thing, where now you're apologizing, you don't really mean to.
Yes, that's a huge thing that I have started to practice in my relationship. And it's thanks to my partner, because that's what he does. He doesn't immediately shut anything down that I put forward. I've always been a pauser. My pausing, I realized before, it would come with silence. My pausing was sometimes attached to shutting down. Because I think there's a difference between a grounded pause, like I'm taking this in and I'm still with you, I'm with you right now, or I'm pausing and I'm disconnecting, right? And I realized there was a very big difference. And through our love, he taught me in an intimate context the importance of pausing, but still saying something to let the other person know where you're at. So he would say something like pausing and then saying, this doesn't feel true right now, but I really want to take on board what you're saying. So he would kind of use that kind of language. So I still feel heard and I still feel understood, but he's still being in integrity with himself. And I really want us to know that we can do both in conversation. I think sometimes we think, I'm either in integrity, which means I just hold my own and I double down. And if I sort of show the other person that I get what they're saying, they will think they're off scot-free. We tend to do that quite a lot. That if I show you compassion and empathy and understanding, you will think, okay, there's free reign, you know. But that's not actually true. That's not actually true. a lot of the time. I think there are cases where that level of openness can be used against you depending on the type of relationship that you're in. But it's really why I believe, Lisa, that if you go through any process of awareness, and it doesn't have to be mine, and through any process of responsibility, you will know the kind of person you're dealing with. That when you're in a point of expression and really needing to put something forward, you need to know who you're dealing with. Because I think sometimes we are only curious about ourselves. What is my communication style? What doesn't work for me? What is my approach? That we're not really curious and really clear on the other person. Because I think when you have that level of understanding, you can use discernment, which is when then maybe you can ask bigger questions of, do I need to leave this relationship? Because I have the awareness, I know what my values are, I've tried mindful expression, I've tried being understanding of the other person, but I still get shut down, still get dismissed. It gets thrown back in my face. There is really no reaching this person. So maybe I need to take responsibility by leaving the relationship, right? But we need to have an understanding of the other person too, not just us. It just can't be one directional.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about love languages, right? So it's kind of like the language that you're just using with the person, and it's not necessarily in the acts of the traditional love languages, but yeah, I mean, I'm trying to almost teach my husband as well what language to use around me as I start to age, and like the words that I hear land on me differently. And it's interesting to think as women how we go through these moments of stages where we can perceive things in different lights. And so there's a woman that I just love, and she's my doctor, Dr. Mindy Pels, and she's the hormone expert, and she talks about there's this study where at the age of 9, if you take a 9-year-old girl and you ask her what she wants to eat for dinner, she'll just literally tell you, she's like, I want pizza, I want chicken nuggets, like they won't think twice about it. You take the same girl at the age of 11 and you ask her what she wants to eat, and she's like, oh, I don't know, what are you eating? We look outside of ourselves to see what everyone else is that we conform and fit in. And now you take it as we get older and we go into perimenopause and menopause and our hormones start changing again. And now we have what we call like the mental resilience is what Mindy calls it. It's like it starts to shed again. And because you're losing the estrogen, you no longer have that resilience anymore. And so as I think about knowing who to talk to, also it's what age are they? What age are you? Because context is everything. Because my husband used to be able to be very blatant to me, say whatever he likes. I was in my mid-20s, I was very resilient. I am edge on the side of more masculine than I do feminine. So I can have like the hard talk and it not bother me. Now I'm 45, he'll say something like, why are you being so mean? The same people, the same understanding of each other, but my hormones are now changing. So now I have to articulate to him to talk to me in a different way. And my tolerance, so going back to kind of where we started at the beginning, I don't know if it's age, I don't know if it's because I've already done these kind of the 3 pillars that you talk about. But for me, I've got less tolerance with bullshit. I've got less tolerance with people being backstabbing, less tolerance with gossip, less tolerance with, like, I just have less tolerance for it. And so now in my older age, I'm more likely to call someone on their BS. I'm more likely to, if someone's passive aggressive around me, I just don't take it. I'm like, I'm so sorry, maybe it's me, but what you just said seems quite offensive. Do you mind explaining what you mean by that sentence? And they may try to gaslight you. And I'm just resilient in enough now where I'm like, but how else am I supposed to understand that comment? And so I have built my resilience through doing the work, through age, through my hormones, but knowing what language to use. So now going back to almost where I first started this interview, if someone has done that work and they're mid-30s, your age, and they've done it all, and they are talking to their boyfriend, and let's say they're out, and you've never seen him disrespect you before, but now he's just staring at another woman. And it's starting to get uncomfortable where it feels like the gaze is a little too hard for your comfort level. Now doing all the work that you've done, how would you respond to that?
Something that I've really learned just in relationship with men and with people in general is sometimes you need to observe, even for a little while or a moment, so you can have a full understanding so that when you then have the conversation, you're able to have it in a richer way. Because in the moment in time, I think instinctively, some women might want to maybe slap his arm and say, "What are you doing?" or something. And then the person turns around and they adjust their behavior. Or you might wait until the person sort of naturally stops and then they come back to dinner and then they're present in that moment. Or you might say, "Hey, can we have a conversation? Can we talk? I just don't feel comfortable with you looking over there."
Or going back to something you said earlier that
Yes.
you do, which I think a lot of women do, is we give the silent treatment.
Absolutely.
Or we pretend nothing's wrong. What do you mean? I'm fine.
100%. It's exactly where I was going to go next, in that I think you mentioned the detail of you've never seen such blatant disrespect in your partner in that way before. So something that will happen is that you'll be flooded with emotions. You'll also be experiencing someone that I would imagine you hold highly in some kind of way. You'll just be experiencing what you might think is sort of like a low-level behavior from them, like a very disrespectful behavior. So there's a lot of things you might experience at the same time. But I think this is where you have to take in the environment. You have to take in the kind of conversation you want to have. Do you want it to be that brief slap on the arm? What are you doing? Can you not do that? But then what is the energy going to be like at the dinner after that? Do you get an apology from the person and then you sort of just carry on? You have to know yourself, is sort of what I'm saying. You have to know yourself so that you know what the most useful response is. Because with me, for example, if my partner was looking at a woman and we're together at dinner, I wouldn't hold that against him necessarily. But if my partner was looking at a woman in a way that I feel is making me extremely uncomfortable, I wouldn't be able to go through the rest of the dinner as if nothing has happened. I would need to say something. I think I would leave it for a moment and wait for the moment that he naturally turns back. For me, it wouldn't be a slap on the arm. I would wait for the moment where he naturally averts his attention back to the dinner, to us, to say, "By the way, I'm just going to be so honest about something, and it feels really vulnerable right now. But that interaction just now made me feel so uncomfortable, and maybe you were not aware of it." Like, I would give grace because I would imagine that I know my person enough, because historically this hasn't happened before. I would say, maybe you didn't mean that intentionally, but I just felt very uncomfortable with how much your attention was over there. But this is not something that we have to talk about right now. I really just want to have a nice dinner with you, but maybe we can talk about it later and I'll tell you why I felt uncomfortable. I think that's what I would do. I wouldn't shut down and bring the sort of cold energy and exterior to the table, because he might not even know that I'm upset and just think that was fine because dinner is fine. So when I bring it up later, it might be a thing of, well, why didn't you say anything? And there might be sort of a big thing and I won't even enjoy the dinner myself. To me, that's the approach I would take. I would wait for him to bring his attention back naturally, because again, I don't want to be in reaction mode. That's really important to me. I want to be responsive, and I will do my best to not say it. I know it's easier said than done. I will just try my best to not have like a antagonistic, confrontational energy. I'll just say, this didn't really feel so good, but I would rather talk about it later. Let's just enjoy dinner for now. And then we can have a conversation about what that triggers within me, because my aim is always to have an effective conversation at the end of it. I don't then want to have an argument and then we're arguing all the way home and then we just build up this energy and don't have an effective conversation where he understands where I'm coming from.
Dude, that was a masterclass. That was so freaking good. Like, I just had to sit here in silence because I was almost seeing where your brain goes.
Yeah.
And I was kind of connecting the dots. And the way that I love that you explained it allows people to take any scenario and apply the thought method that you just did right there. I'm going to go to the other example that I gave, where you're with your family and they just make a comment about the thing that is you're most insecure about. Usually, at least, look, I come from a very Greek family, so there's no shame to talk about your weight to your face. Oh my God, you've gotten so fat. Like, they'll just say that to your face and not think twice about it. Or about whether you're with somebody, are you dating someone, are you married? If you are married, when are you gonna have kids? Like, it's all the judgment of what they think you should. So in that moment where you have somebody saying to you, hey, you really put on weight, oh my God, you look terrible. What's wrong with you? Where's your boyfriend? Blah, blah, blah. How would someone respond to that?
Family is the trickiest one even when I work with people one-to-one and I speak with groups, family is always the part where it's like, it feels like the stakes are higher. And I think a little bit of context that I'll add to that is, regardless of whether you're 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, whatever, when you're around your family, there's something that happens where you feel like a child again. It's so crazy and it's so unique because it doesn't really happen elsewhere, unless it's with childhood friends where a similar thing happens where you sort of revert back. There's sort of reverting that happens. So I actually believe that with family, that's where you have to be much firmer than elsewhere. And I think it's a beautiful practice, and this will look so different for everyone, so you will use it in the way that you need to. But I think for a lot of us, our task with family is to remind them that you are not a child anymore. Because what happens is you're made to feel like a child again. You're made to feel like you should just take on the jokes. You're made to feel that you should just, if anyone has a very outrageous and inappropriate question, you should just laugh it off or answer it. You're basically, what I'm saying in simple terms is that a lot of us believe subconsciously that there's a version of ourselves that we owe to our family. And it's usually the version that lived in the home with the family. We truly believe, and it's a really entrenched belief where we feel like I owe my family this version. I'm this person out there in the world. I'm this person in my relationship. I take myself seriously. But once you're back with your family, you feel like you owe them a very specific version of you. And you have to completely shatter that to the ground. And it might be a very difficult thing to do. It doesn't mean you blow the lid on everything, but I'm so sorry, for some of us, it does mean that. For some of us, it does mean we put very firm boundaries and say, you can't speak to me like that anymore. Maybe you even pull someone to the side and say, I just need to be very honest with you, but you cannot speak to me like that anymore. I know that I've allowed it for a very, very long time. I know that I even used to laugh at it when you used to comment on my weight, but you cannot speak to me like that anymore. And that's really, really important to me. I love you and I just want to be very honest with you. I don't want to start avoiding you or whatever it might be. Because for some of us, we start avoiding, we cut family off. Even today, we're encouraged to cut family off so quickly without even having the conversation. So I think it's really deciding that, you know what, to my family, but also to my partner, even to my kids, etc. But family, I do not owe them that version of me, and I will have to tell them. So in that moment where something happens, you might have to be the one that makes everything awkward for a moment and just say, you can't speak to me like that anymore. Okay. Or you pull someone to the side. I'm always for having difficult conversations in a private context if you can, before you have something or do something publicly. Because I think it's just very vulnerable, and I always take into account the very real world fallout of difficult conversations. I don't want people to prematurely put themselves in situations that they won't be able to handle the fallout from. So I think getting someone to the side, if it's that uncle or that aunt or even a parent or your sibling, and just having a very honest conversation as an adult, that's to me the first point of sort of reference. But I want to be very clear that for some of us, certain things have gone on for so long that you will have to be that person that makes everything awkward for a while to remind everyone that actually you're an adult. You're not a child anymore.
Have you experienced any of that?
Absolutely.
In your family?
I have. I experienced it with a cousin of mine. I think about in 2018. It was around Christmas time. And he's someone that is he was going through an addiction of his own, and especially at that time he was, and he had come to stay with me and my family at our family home for the Christmas period. And he was just behaving in a way that was so out of line for so many reasons, but because no one had ever called him out, he felt that he could say whatever he wants to say and no one's going to correct him on it. And because he's about 2 years older than me, and we grew up together, always playing together and being very, very close. So there's a version of me that he's used to, and he'd never really experienced the sober version of me. So he thought that he could speak to me in a certain way, that he could talk down at me in a certain way. But he met a very different me, a me that he was not used to, a me that actually challenged him, a me that told him he can't behave like that in our family home. But he was used to me behaving a certain way in our family home. So I went through like a very brief internal conflict because I felt like, who am I? I used to behave in a way that was somewhat similar to him. Who am I to try and correct him? Who am I to try and be self-righteous? Even though I wasn't being self-righteous, he was disrespecting my mother's home and I had to say something. No one else was saying anything. But it was that moment which led to so many moments like that, without confrontation, but so many moments where I had a crossroads. I could either perform the version of Africa that he was always used to, or somewhat enable his behavior maybe through laughter and sort of subtle signs of co-signing. Or I could actually just be very direct and say, you can't behave in that way. You really just can't. Even if it's uncomfortable for me to say it right now, my voice was shaking, but I had to remind him that we're not children anymore. We're not teenagers anymore. You don't get to speak to me or anyone in this house in that way. And even though it was very difficult for him, it led to an argument, but he accepted it. And from then on, he's always met me as the person that I am now. But it took that conflict to happen. But you know what? When the conflict happens, you have planted a seed that has potential to actually sprout into something. Whereas if we keep on just forcing ourselves to be 12 again, to be 25 again, to be 35 again, to be that specific version that is frozen in time, you will always be fragmented. And I would go as far as to say you will never be truly in integrity in your life outside of the family home. As long as you're still performing the you that you were in the family dynamic, in your family of origin, I really don't believe that you'll be fully expressed in every other area of life.
Yeah. Agreed. What do you do though in that moment? Sometimes you get people that are like, she's so sensitive, or like, well, aren't we touchy?
Yes.
Or you've changed.
Man.
All these words and phrases that are made to make you feel small again. How would you handle that in that moment?
You're being made to feel ashamed. You know, you're being made to feel like you're the one that's in the wrong. That's just the reality of it. You are the one that's in the wrong. You're just taking this way too far and you don't need to. We're just joking around. We're always like this. Why suddenly do you know? But the thing that's happening there, and it ties in with the last thing that I said, the thing that's happening there is that you have to stay grounded in the person that you are now. So it might mean a confrontation. It might mean you actually challenging what's being said and asking further questions. To say, but why do you think it's okay to speak to me like that? Please just tell me that. Why do you think that I have to accept that? I think sometimes this is where you reflect the other person's behavior. To say, can you please just genuinely tell me why you think it's okay to make a comment on my weight? Why do you think it's okay that I should just take it? Maybe there's something that I'm not understanding, right? Ask the person to check in on their own thought process. Because I think doing the easy thing of going straight into argument and maybe walking out, etc. But you might feel like you need to actually physically leave. Maybe that is actually your boundary, to be like, you know what, this is enough. I visited and I came and I put my boundary forward and you're still not taking it on board. I'm just going to leave. You know, maybe that's what you need to do. But I invite people, if they are able to do this, to try and reflect the other person's behavior to themselves. Hold the mirror up so they can see themselves, so they can decide if they're still okay with it. And if they are, this is where you do have to put a boundary forward. This might be where you have to put a physical boundary forward and actually leave.
Thank you for taking us through that. That was super freaking powerful. And, you know, I think the family is tricky, especially because we've been brought up with the, like, you've only got one mom, you've only got one dad. And working with Dr. Ramani and just having interviewed her so many times, and how specifically narcissistic mothers, that comes up a lot. Where it's like, but you've only got one mom. So it's like, so what, I have to take her narcissistic behavior every time I see her? Like, I think giving people permission for people to, like, it is okay to walk away if that's what you need for your mental health.
I would say for the most part, people are not experiencing those sort of extreme, obvious attacks. It's really subtle things that can actually allow you to say to someone, hey, can we have a conversation later? After lunch, can I have a little chat with you? and then privately you speak to them about it. I think most of us are in those situations. And I think for those of us that are in the more extreme things, if you will, where things are happening around other people and you always feel like there's a spotlight on you, you are the one that's going to have to be very firm and really have bigger boundaries, whether it's the physical boundaries of walking away or in front of other people, because sometimes the social proof is important to say, you can't speak to me like that anymore. Sometimes it's useful for other people, for the trance to be shattered, to be like, oh, actually, this was never okay. Sometimes that's also very useful. I think a lot of us will just have different paths that we can walk down, but I would love to think that we can use all of these different tools and the way that this conversation has gone to actually see what this can apply in your life. But I think it's in the little tiny things that people will say, whether it's in your family or not, where you have an opportunity to correct someone or say, actually, I'm not okay with that. Or do you mind if we don't joke about that anymore? I just don't find it so funny these days. You know?
The way that you say it as well is so like, there's so much confidence around it, but grace. Like you say, I come across very aggressive. And so I get that a lot where I'm like, I really don't feel aggressive. I'm just trying to like be firm.
Yes.
But I do think tone, and you talk about that in your book, about how tone and pitch and sound matter.
It makes I think that's the fun part of conversation. We have an instrument that we're working with. The voice is an instrument. So you need to modify it depending on what you're doing and who you're speaking with and the level of conflict. And I truly believe that communication is an art form. You can practice, and you're an artist, you know. The more you do it, you just become so much better. There were things that maybe you thought, oh, I wouldn't be able to draw that. It's in my mind or it's here, but I can't draw. But through practice, you find that you can just do it. You can adjust and you can modify. And with tone, I think we always have to remember, and some people think, you know, they're like, yeah, but that's tone policing when you tell people about their tone. Communication, a big part of it is about the nonverbal. It is about it's in the tonality, it's in the delivery, it's even in your face. If you have a slight smile on your face when you're saying something that is kind of difficult to hear, the other person can register it in a different way. It's in so many little things, but I think moment to moment, find opportunities where you can really practice that. Because if we wait for the big moments around the dinner table with the family, when they finally say something and you stand up for yourself, you'll just be relying on kind of fleeting moments of courage, you know, when actually you could be building that muscle every single day in every interaction. So when that thing happens with your family, you're strong already. You're not kind of just waiting for the adrenaline of being like, fuck this, I'm going to say something. You know, it would just come from a moment where you say, actually, Auntie, I just don't find that funny, you know. And it gets to, you kind of come to a point of where the charge is kind of removed from it. Because sometimes if you show people you really care and you're upset, especially if people have sort of those narcissistic traits, they just love that because they've got you, you know. But if you're able to stand in your courage and your voice and your delivery, to say that, to be assertive, basically, to be firm, then that can actually make someone think, oh shit, okay. They might still give that appearance of, oh, we're just joking. But next time you will see they might not do it again, you know.
I found that as a woman that people are more likely to dismiss me if I have a heightened expression than a man. So it's like, oh, well, you just get an emotional. And so I realized, going back to the thing that we said earlier, was like, what's your goal? Does this serve you? And I realized that the anger inside me gave me the confidence to speak up, but in speaking up with anger, allowed them to dismiss the value that I was trying to bring.
Yes. All of this, going through these general steps, even just in your thinking, right? Thinking about, what is my end goal here? So my partner has looked at someone across the table. I feel quite enraged and very upset about it. But actually, what is my end goal? Do I just want to let out this anger and then that's it, that's the goal? Because maybe that is for you. Maybe that is in that moment in time. But if you're thinking in that effective way, I invite people to think with an effective mindset. What is the most effective approach? Because then that removes that kind of reactive and the emotion and this is what I want to say right now. Is it going to be effective? What I say right now, does it have the power to change the course of every other family dinner that we have? Or is it just going to be me being angry in this moment? Auntie, you can't speak to me in that way. We have an argument. And then it happens again next time because I didn't actually ground myself in saying something that is really important that could change something. So I think when we have that sort of goal in mind, and it's easier said than done, but it absolutely can be done through small practice over time, you will just start thinking in that way of what is the most effective thing to do in this moment. And I think that's much more useful than just allowing for your emotions to drive the conversation.
Yeah, I love that. And I always think about how do you command a room, not demand a room.
Yes. Oh,
and
that's
so
good.
when you walk in without
Yes.
emotion and you have the confidence in what you're saying, I think it ends up you command a room and people then just don't question it.
Yes.
But this then take the final one, which is the work environment. So I think that is another very different dynamic because you're all getting paid to be there. There's no emotional connection. Maybe there is because you've made friends over time, but you are there as a collective, as part of the company, not part of like hearts and souls and what you actually have in common. And so in those moments where I think some people will, because no one wants to necessarily have a brawl in the middle of a workplace, they're more likely to be passive aggressive, drop hints and comments that can be disrespectful, that can press your buttons. But if it was a transcript and if it was on paper, no one would take offense to it. So there's nuance in how they say it. How would you handle something where something was nuanced, where they're saying something, you see what they're trying to do, but it's not outright visible? How would you handle that?
It can be almost similar to the familial example in the sense that, especially when it's work, and whether you like it or not, you're there to make an impression. Who you are at work and how you're experienced by other people can determine whether you're promoted. It's tied to your salary. It's tied to your well-being. It's tied to your reputation, which is another context that also applies to the familial aspect, but in a different way. I think when it comes to work, reputation is a big part of it. What is my reputation with my colleagues? Because that reputation will inform whether I get a promotion, and the promotion is tied to sort of my financial security, XYZ, high stakes. It's a high stakes environment. So I think assertiveness and confidence and sort of speaking up, it's really useful to practice it in front of other people. That is very important. So I think that's one way to approach it, where in a meeting, someone maybe dismisses what you said, or you say something and it's dismissed by the person that's leading the meeting. Maybe it's the person that you've noticed has this kind of sort of energy towards you or something along those lines. But in the next moment, they put forward an idea that you have just put forward, but they put it forward as your own. So there's this thing of sort of being dismissed, which women experience all the time, where something they will say gets sort of just sort of put to the side, but then it's said again by a male voice, or maybe someone that is more dominant, and it's dismissed, and they don't say anything, or they don't claim their idea as their own. And it's finding a sort of smart way to say it, because something does have to be said, and it has to be witnessed by other people. You have to be seen asserting yourself. Sometimes there's also room for useful interruption, where you say, so sorry, I was speaking. Would you mind if I finish what I have to say? Right? That's a very important one. And again, tonality. You don't have to go into the, excuse me, I was speaking, because that doesn't project that kind of self-leadership that we want. If that person keeps on interrupting or dismissing, excuse me, Kevin, I was just finishing. Would you mind if I continue this? And then I would love to pass it over to you. Right? They're different weight, but you have to assert yourself, because that example of pulling someone to the side has its use, because I think you still would need to maybe have a conversation with him after. But what you need in that environment is to be seen being assertive. You need to be seen in your courage. You need to be seen in your self-leadership, because that communicates to other people how they can treat you, but it also communicates to other people that you're available for maybe certain projects, that you're available for certain things that require leadership. Whereas I think what tends to happen a lot of the time is that someone will be interrupted and they've already started to believe that that person who is more dominant is above them in some kind of way. So they won't feel that they can challenge that person. but you absolutely can. I think it's how you challenge. It's the nuances of how you do it. I think you can do it in a very graceful way, like the example that I've given, and you still have a conversation with that person to say, by the way, I've just noticed something, that I think is really important for me to be able to tell you. You are my manager, so a part of me did feel like I'm not able to talk to you about this, but I think it's very important for both of us because it might be something you're not aware of. But sometimes when we're in conversation, I do feel that you don't give me the chance to finish what I need to say. And if I'm completely wrong or you don't experience it in that way, please do just let me know. But I wanted to bring this forward to you just so we don't have this sort of energy where I'm experiencing something and not saying anything. Just tell me your thoughts. So you allow for the other person, again, hold a mirror up to people that are being difficult when it comes to behavior as best as you can. Because then you're just not, you also then don't feel like you're just bringing things to the table. You're sort of reflecting back, give them an opportunity to say, maybe they experience you as being quite meek or not really having anything to say. So they find themselves talking over you because they think you don't really want to contribute. Maybe you have that apologetic demeanor that I was speaking about earlier, where they feel like you don't really have anything quick to say or any contributions to make. That's how they're reading you. So it's bringing out that thing in them where they feel like, okay, maybe Lisa doesn't have anything to add, right? Maybe there's something you can't see. But I think you need to come with an assertive energy in the meeting. When something happens, you will know what you need to say depending on the context, but something has to be said where you assert yourself in a graceful, grounded way, not from a place of fear, of being afraid or being fed up, because that's what tends to happen. We speak when we're fed up, but that communicates the wrong message. It's not effective to the goal that you have, which I would hope is communicating that you're assertive. People are actually looking at you like, okay, all right, someone finally spoke up to this guy, but still have the private conversation with the source. That's important too.
Girl, thank you so much for everything you've just broken down today. Your book, The Third Perspective, is phenomenal. I think everybody should buy it. Where can they buy the book and find you and follow you and all of that good stuff?
Yes, so you can buy the book in any major bookstore, but also support your independent bookstores, order it from the library. There's a way in which I invite people to read this actually, because it's full of exercises. Something that happens, I know with readers, we think, I'm going to come back to this later. I'll just read through, I'll come back to this later. So I invite everyone to just read through it first. Don't do the exercises first. Just read through the entire thing, take it in, and then come back and do the exercises, because it's a very, very practical book. You can find it everywhere books are sold, and you can find me on social media, Instagram, at AfricaBrooke with an E at the end. And I'm always available for people's thoughts and ideas and any questions you have. If there's anything you want to challenge about the book or what I've said, and I'm cracking up in my mind, because imagine I say that and then I'm defensive. Like, what do you mean? What do you mean you didn't agree with chapter 7?
Oh my God, that's so good. Motherfucker, I told you I wasn't going to hear the truth, but I disagree with you. That's amazing.
But please, I'm open to it. It's embodied. I'm open to the honesty. But Lisa, I just love you. I'm so grateful for you. And to sit here with you right now is it's so magical. Thank you.
If you're totally fed up of people walking all over you and you want to know how to finally stand up for yourself and take your power back, then click here right now. So many of us women feel the pressure to get married, have kids, have the career before it's, let's say, too late.